Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowsky Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. When I covered City Hall for New York Newsday many years ago, my bureau chief, Bill Murphy, had a wonderful description of Mayor Ed Koch, saying he was unavoidable for comment. Now he is 86 years old, and Koch is not yet ready to go away, and in fact has set Albany on its ear with his New York Uprising reform campaign, which includes calls to institute nonpartisan redistricting for Assembly and Senate districts, instead of the current system in which each chamber draws its own lines to the benefit of its incumbents. Koch has the radical idea that voters should pick their representatives instead of representatives picking their voters. Now Governor Cuomo has introduced legislation to codify the proposal by establishing a nonpartisan or at least bipartisan redistricting commission that excludes recent lawmakers, government staffers, and lobbyists, all categories of people who have been called upon after past censuses to carry water for the respective majorities in each chamber. Who could be against such a fair, reasonable, seemingly non-controversial idea? Well, nowhere does civics and politics collide with more of a thud than in drawing district lines, both for the legislature and for Congress, which is made more complicated this year because New York is losing 2 of our seats in Washington as a result of the census. There are, as always in Albany and in politics in general, games within games. Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver, who last year refused to sign Koch's pledge, has introduced a measure to carry out Cuomo's plan. Meanwhile, Senate Majority Leader Dean Skelos, a Republican who knows a popular issue when he sees one, made sure that every Republican senator signed on to Koch's plan, but now he's in no hurry to carry it out. Maybe Skelos and Silver know how to count. It seems to me that Democrats are awfully short-sighted if they don't grab onto any proposal for fair redistricting. The power of map makers is apparent in that the same 19 million people in New York State can be carved up to create a 60-seat Democratic majority in the state Assembly, but a 2-seat Republican majority in the state Senate. Senator Michael Gianaris, a Democrat, noted that Democratic state Senate candidates got 250,000 more votes than Republicans in the last election, but because of how the lines were drawn, overwhelmingly Democratic districts versus districts where Republicans had smaller but still safe majorities, the Republicans were able to take the chamber back from the Democrats. We're joined by 4 New Yorkers with a variety of views on this decennial collision of civics and politics. Ed Sullivan is a former assemblyman who went through 2 redistrictings in his district based in Morningside Heights and was my assemblyman. Esmeralda Simmons is the executive director of the Medgar Evers Center for Law and Social Justice, who sat on the districting commission that redrew city council lines. Angelo FALCON is the founder and director of the National Institute for Latino Policy, and Michael Aronson is a member of the Daily News Editorial Board, which has been a leading voice in calling for Albany reform. Michael, the board has been very vocal in support of what Koch is trying to do and basically trying to clean up Albany. Is what Ed is doing a good idea, and are you surprised at what happened today?
Well, last week, Koch went up to Albany to meet with Skelos and the other members, and I don't know why he was surprised, but Skelos, turned on him. As you said in your opening, Skelos and all the Republicans said, we support this plan, vote for us, put us in power. They did. And then now it came time, okay, are you going to carry through? And he said, I want to do the budget. Are you going to carry through? Well, there were a lot of plans. You're going to carry through. Well, we could change the state constitution and fix it in 10 years. And so Koch basically said he was a liar. And
he didn't say pants on fire. He said he would say liar, liar, pants on fire. He didn't do that.
And the question is Skelos going to move? It's not in Skelos' interest. Okay, we can get into this discussion later, but the state has several million more enrolled Democrats than Republicans. The Democrats have won statewide elections for president every 4 years, for governor, for attorney general, for U.S. Senate. There are more Democrats in the state than Republicans, and Democrats tend to do better. So if the lines are drawn fairly, the expectation would be that the Democrats would control the Senate. Well, the lines have not been drawn fairly. For 50, 60 years, the Republicans in the Senate and the Democrats on the other side drew the lines in a crooked fashion to favor their party. And if the lines were drawn fairly in the Democrats, would they have 100 seats? Probably not. Maybe they've had 90 seats. Still, they'd have a large majority. So that's why Skelos said he would do it to win election, and that's why he's not doing it, because it's not in his interest, and he's afraid that he'll lose and he'll be out of power.
Ed, you were an assemblyman for 26 years. You went through 2 redistrictings.
Actually 3, yeah.
3, and how conscious were you of protecting your seat in particular in the process?
Well, there are several things that you want to, of course you want to protect your seat. I mean, do you want to continue in this work? Yes, you want to continue in this work, but to what lengths are you going to go to protect it? In the last redistricting, I was asked what I thought should be done. I live in Morningside Heights. I said, there is a place called Morningside Heights. We're carved up in the city council. We're carved up in the Congress. We're carved up in the state senate. I'm in the assembly, right? I was. I don't want it carved up. I think we have an integral community, and we should be a community. In towns upstate, the rules have generally been that you don't cut a town in half. Why is it that a community in New York City can be cut in half rather casually? So I said, if you cut me in half, you're going to get 2 Ed Sullivans on your neck, and they didn't like that idea very much. And so I, through that thread, I was able to keep it integral. Now, here's the trick: you got certain rules. It's got to be one man, one vote. All the districts have to be more or less the same size. And therefore, since we don't have 125, I think there are 126,000 people in Morningside Heights, we have to attach places from other sections to our district. So what's good for Morningside Heights, in this case, turned out to be not so good for some of the people in some of the border areas of other districts. And that's the reality. And no matter who draws the lines, that's going to be a reality.
Esmeralda, keeping communities together is a priority. There is the Voting Rights Act determines how you can draw certain lines in terms of not breaking up racial concentrations, to deny deny minority communities the right to elect people of their own choice, whatever that particular legal language is.
You got it.
You're looking at what Koch is doing and what the priorities of what the governor has said, which basically says to try to keep communities together. Is this too complicated a process to meet all those priorities?
No, it's not too complicated a process, but I don't want anyone to think that composing a new commission, independent, quote, I'm going to put big quotes around independent commission, really changes the game that much. I think independent commissions are great, but I don't think that they're all that independent. I've sat on independent commissions in New York City, and I can tell you there were messages flying from City Hall over, etc. Some people were listening intently, and others like myself were deaf to those things. I'm a voting rights attorney, and I work to make sure that people in this state, and particularly my constituents, which are the black citizens and the black residents of New York State, get their fair share. Fair share. When you have an independent commission, all I'm laying out there, and I've read the governor's proposal, which has now been, quote, adopted by the speaker. All I have to say is somebody has to appoint. I know that they've tried to shield the appointment process, but even in their shielding of the appointment process, somebody has to appoint the independent commission. And then you have to have that commission basically put on blinders, be like the 3 monkeys, hear no, speak no, see no, in order to keep those people, quote, independent. I haven't seen too many human beings interested in that process. I think it's a better process than what we have now, but I don't really think that it's going to wind up being that independent. I would love to be proven wrong. The other thing I think is very, very interesting is that, and it does have very good provisions. I'm talking about the bill provisions in terms of respecting the rights of, quote, racial minority voters. What I am most concerned about is that the redistricting is done on time, not delayed, because people are arguing about how it's going to occur, what the process is going to be, whether it's the current / independent commission, which isn't independent at all, which is run by the legislature as the Constitution required, or an independent commission would then gives the legislature something to vote on. I am most concerned that we come up with plans from the state so that we can begin the process, the long litigation process of coming out with actually a plan that will be ready to be voted on by September of 2012.
Angelo, there's because of the nature of ethnic politics in this city, particularly, Esmeralda's talking about the black community. You've been active through the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund, a lot of other groups, in kind of empowering Latinos so that they're not split up. Do you get a sense that now that you've got a seat at the table, that they're changing the rules?
Well, I mean, one of the problems I have in getting involved with redistricting is the results. One of the most popular things I say when I talk to Latino audiences is I get up and I say, a big problem we have is all these Latino politicians, elected officials, they're all a bunch of crooks. And I get a standing ovation. It's like a cheap shot, but hey, you do what you have to do to get a standing ovation. But one of the things, the outcome of this whole process is one that has, in the Latino community, created a tremendous amount of cynicism when you look at the number of people that are indicted, that are in jail. So one of the problems we have is, so we have some Latinos now. We have a Latino co-chair of the Senate part of the Redistricting Commission. But, I think in the Latino community, I think in other communities, people are looking beyond just the ethnicity of the person and looking at the quality of the leadership. So that's one of the, I think, problems that we have. Now, I have no problems with many of the reforms that are being proposed in the Cuomo, bill. I just object to using the term independent commission because I think it's misleading. I mean, ultimately, according to the state constitution, it's a legislature that has to vote on these things. I mean, they get 3 shots in the proposal. Right. 2 times, you give it to the legislature, they can't make any amendments.
It's an up or down.
3rd time, they can make changes. And then there's all sorts of things that happen in between. I think as
those are provisions of the bill that that they can present a plan, the legislature can vote up or down with no changes. They can present a second plan up or down, and the 3rd time you can amend it.
Wait them out.
Yeah, and so ultimately the legislature, votes on this thing. So it's not really independent. And then secondly, I think there's the issues, as Esmeralda mentioned. We have the experience of working with an independent commission in New York City. After this stuff is over, all this craziness, you go to redistricting the city council, and there's an independent commission there. Well, we've had first-hand experience with how independent it is. She mentioned, the kind of informal kind of communications between these independent commissioners and the political people behind them, it becomes problematic. Now, the thing is that I think there are a lot of good reforms in there. And so I would have been more comfortable if it was people who said, look, I have a proposal to reform the process and make it more responsive. That's it. But I hate the idea of using the term independent because I think it kind of lets the legislature off the hook. It gives the impression that they have nothing to do with this thing when that's not the case.
Maybe if you take away the word independent.
Yeah.
And just call it bipartisan. Because as the audience either here or watching at home has to understand, the New York legislature is the worst in the world.
I don't know if this is the world.
Okay.
World.
Okay. If I can finish.
Mars and
as someone who served there for 26 years, I'm sure you could have lots of experience. It is completely undemocratic. Anything you've ever learned in civic class about how bills become laws, how legislators work, none of it works.
That's right.
The committees are fake.
Well, the schools don't teach that stuff anyway, so.
They
didn't learn that.
No, this is not a joke.
Right.
Okay. That the hearings are fake, the committee chairmanships are fake. It's a 2-man operation. In the assembly.
That's not true, incidentally, but
okay.
go on.
In the assembly, there's a gentleman named Sheldon Silver. He's the Speaker of the Assembly. He represents 1 district downtown Manhattan. He managed to convince 100 other Democrats to make him the Speaker. So they voted for him. And he caters to those 100 Democrats. The 50 Republicans get lost. Doesn't matter. If you're a Republican in the state assembly, and 1/3 of the state, 18 million people, live in assembly Republican districts, they don't exist. They don't get legislation through. They don't get assistance to nonprofit groups. They don't get anything. They don't even get pencils. Okay? In the state Senate, it's much closer. It's about 62 members, and it's 32-30. 2 years ago, the Democrats had 32, and they completely oppressed and obliterated the Republicans. And now the Republicans come back, and they have 32, and the Democrats are out. All the Democratic staff was fired because their budget was wiped out. They have no authority. The way it's done in Albany is the ruling side draws the lines. So Mr. Silver and his computers draw the lines. They take a community like Bay Ridge in Brooklyn, which is relatively conservative. And guys like John McCain do well there. The state Senate elects a Republican. The city council had a Republican there. And they take that relatively homogeneous conservative district, heavily Catholic, and they cut it up into 5 districts to make sure that a Republican cannot be elected. And they achieve what they want. They elect only Democrats in that district. And you multiply that across the state, and in fact, the districts are not the same size.
We know.
They are allowed to have a 5% variance.
Not under the Cuomo bill.
Under the way it's been in New York.
Right.
So you take 150 people, you divide the state, and then you start moving down. Mr. Silver's district is the smallest in the state in terms of population because he wants as few as people in his district as possible. But the Republican districts are all the largest ones. So his is 4.9% smaller than the average, and the Republican ones are all 4.9% larger, a 10% variation.
That's just in the assembly, though.
That's in the assembly. In the Senate, it's the same thing. And so what they've done is they've drawn the lines, as Bob said in his opening, so that the elected people select their voters. I'm picking who I'm going to represent, as opposed to the voters every 2 years picking their representatives. So what this nonpartisan plan or bipartisan would give the oppressed minority, and I'm talking political minority, Republican or Democrat, a say. So Mr. Silver won't be able to draw the lines, by his own whim. And Mr. Skelos in the Senate won't be able to draw the lines under this plan.
Why not? Because
what he does is he wipes out the other side, and if half the people in the state
I understand the moral reason
get
why not.
disenfranchised.
I realize the moral reason, but why do you think that he's not going to let the thing go through the 2 phony read-ins and then go to the place where they're able to make amendments to the bill and make the amendments that he wants to make? And then it'll pass it and be the same.
No. Let's be clear. Then it won't pass. Then we will all march over to federal court.
Yeah.
A court will appoint a lawyer as a master, and then we will do this process
I'm signing
all
you up.
over.
I'm signing you up.
And it's going to go there anyway.
Thank you. All over again, and in the end, 3 federal judges will decide what the districts are.
But
And
they'll-
that's what's going to happen
they'll take
under
the
any
work that was started by the commission.
It is explicit.
let's-
It is explicit in the governor's proposal that neither political party nor protecting incumbents can be, if I remember reading it, can
on
be
the-
a priority in deciding how you draw the line.
My problem is the reforms are needed. I see a lot of things that can be done to make the process better. I just don't like the idea of overselling it.
Right.
Overselling what this bill can do. The way you laid it out, right? It sounds like this thing is going to revolutionize things. Well, it's not. Number 2 is the issue that it's not a silver
It's not
bullet.
going to change any of the things you complained about.
It's part
Nothing.
of a
You complained
broader.
about
It's
what
part of a
let's try
broader.
it.
No. I'm saying let's try, but I'm just saying that I think it has to be put in some sort of perspective. The other thing is that it's not a silver bullet. There are other processes involved. In the Latino community, for example, one of the concerns we've had increasingly is the unresponsiveness of the Democratic Party, period, to the community. So within this process, the parties don't go away. They're very much active in this process. So part of the problem is that there's a lot more when we talk to folks in the Latino community about getting our community organized, making sure we're at the table on these issues, dealing with other issues like campaign finance, all sorts of other things as well, and dealing with this ethics problem that we have, obviously. So the thing is, what I find every 10 years when we do this, sometimes people over-argue what the impact's going to be. And I think that's the danger. And like I said about the independence part of it, I think we still have to hold these guys accountable. The public needs to know that these guys are still, whether it's in front or behind the scenes, means these are the guys that are manipulating the system as much as they can. What you're trying to do is ameliorate the problem so that they do as least damage as possible.
And it doesn't work. The seat that I first got, which was at that time called the 70th Assembly District, was drawn by the Justice Department of who was the president before Jimmy Carter? Ford.
Gerald Ford.
Ford's
And Nixon.
Well, Ford and Nixon, they drew the lines in order to make a black seat, as they called it, right? So what happened? As soon as the lines were redrawn, they had an election. A white person ran the first time, and I won the second time. I mean, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And that was they weren't doing it to favor the Democrats in New York City.
Do you think, setting aside if it's real, well, do you think it's realistic? Do you think it's desirable not to use not to have protecting incumbents as a preference, or to have political party as a preference in how you draw those lines?
You're asking the question, should self-interest be a part of politics?
No.
And of course it shouldn't, but it is. As it is a part of business and part of education and part of everything else. I mean,
But isn't this precisely because you have a self-interest, you as a category of people, not you personally, because you have that self-interest, it's an attempt to shield it from that self-interest.
Let me make a suggestion. Why not have a blue ribbon commission? How I hate that name, but anyway, let's call it a
Change the color.
a green ribbon commission, and have them come up and be the, you name the best. Ed Koch, of course, has got to be on it. Carl McCall, get the gang on there, right? And have
I
them.
don't know anything about redistricting.
And have them.
Please don't.
And have them come up with a line, and then have the legislature pass it if they think they want to, in defiance of that commission. And then we have a battle. Then we have politics.
But they could be the appointed people. I mean, Shelley Silver can appoint Ed Koch if he wants to the commission.
Yes.
Now,
Or me.
over the years at the Daily News, we have all types of politicians coming to talk to us. And something just stuck in my mind for years. Jerry Nadler, who's a very liberal congressman from west side of Manhattan in Brooklyn. He's been in the Congress since 1992. Before that, for like 15, 20 years, he was in the Assembly. I asked him 10 years ago, I said, how do you fix Albany? And he gave me an answer. John Faso, I don't know if you know him, but he was the guy, unfortunately for him, who ran against Elliot Spitzer, and then Spitzer later resigned. And 4 years before, he ran against Alan Hevesy, and Hevesy resigned.
It was also on the redistricting commission for the state.
So he lost to two guys who later got into a lot of trouble. He was in the Assembly for a long time from upstate, conservative Republican, and he was the leader there. And I've asked him, how do you fix Albany? Years apart, no prompting. The answer immediately from Nadler, a Democrat, was fair redistricting. Faso gave the same answer because you said, Angelo, that the people need to be held accountable, the legislators. Well, they're accountable at election time, but they're only accountable if they can be challenged. And if Mr. Silver and his friends and the Mr. Skelos has drawn the district in such a way that you're picking your voters, so you can never be defeated in your district. You can then rob and cheat and steal and lie for 2 years, and then it's election time, and you're impregnable because you can't be defeated. And if the district is fair, then when it's accountability time, and if you're over the 18 and you're a citizen, you can go in and vote, you can throw the bums out, but you have to have a chance for someone else to compete against them. So it goes back to accountability.
In the election where the Democrats took over the state Senate in 4 years ago, who drew those lines?
Those are Joe Bruno lines.
The Republicans drew the lines, and yet the Democrats won.
Well, the thing is, I think I'm not in disagreement with what you're saying. The thing about overselling it is the thing I'm concerned about, because I think we need more transparency. We need to have ways that you make the thing as transparent as possible, and you have to have community participation. The other problem with this process, it becomes very technical. A small number of people, some election lawyers.
One guy in a room with a computer.
Right, three guys, and then three guys sitting there, the process is a really cynical one in Albany, right? Every 10 years, what they would do in the past is they would bring the legislators in one by one and cut a deal with them in terms of their maps. By the way, the state legislature also does the congressional redistricting. That's not a federal thing. So they bring the Congress people in and kind of say, look, this is what we're going to give you, take it or leave it or whatever, and deal with that. So it's a very nasty process. It's a very nasty process. But how do you get community participation so that, in fact, you hold people accountable and get them involved? How do you have the kind of transparency where people actually see what's going on? How do you empower other players so that they can also draw maps and have access to the data? And those are the kinds of things that I think help the process in opening it up. My concern is that, again, I don't want to oversell the process in the sense of, it's going to be a struggle, because ultimately, until you have a constitutional, a change where you actually can have a commission that is not controlled at all, is not connected to the legislators, you're not going to have the kind of independence you really need. And there are other states like California and others that have that. So this is not my argument. I'm not doing a skillless argument saying let's put it off. Rather, there are reforms that we can make now to try to deal with the issues you're talking about. But I think we have to be realistic about it and also look at the other aspects of the political process as well.
I'm most concerned about, and I think I'm going to echo something that Angelo has said. Albany's a mess, granted. Slight exaggeration on your part about how messy it is, but it's such a big mess that let's just write it off as a mess. The real question we're talking about is why are we even concerned about Albany? We're concerned about Albany because we're interested in whether there is a democracy in New York State. The truth of it is that the election laws make sure there's no democracy. Redistricting makes sure there's no democracy. The campaign rules make sure there's no democracy. The lobbyists make sure there's no democracy. The, quote, special interests make sure there's no democracy. The Supreme Court makes sure there's no democracy. Corporations are persons. So redistricting is not the cure-all.
But it's a piece.
It's a piece.
Yeah.
It's a piece.
And it's now time for that piece.
It's been time for that piece,
No, I mean,
but it is not. Let me finish.
It's every 10
Let
years.
me finish. I know. I've been doing this for 40 years. I'm not kidding. This is my fourth redistricting. I know this process. Let me tell you, when we change redistricting, and we will change it, when we get more community involvement, we will start changing the other things that are wrong with Albany. And the major thing that's wrong with Albany is that the people have no real say in what happens in Albany. That's what's wrong. It is not a representative democracy, but neither is Congress. So let's just be clear.
What about Saudi Arabia? Would you call that a representative?
No, absolutely not. But let's not start comparing because it might start getting a little hot and uncomfortable in here.
But as to your point, the same, I would say, crooked legislature that drew the districts also drew the congressional districts. And this year, something interesting happened. 5 incumbent New York congressmen lost. Now, more than any other state in the union. Fellow in Staten Island lost, someone in Hudson Valley, a couple upstate. Now, maybe they were freshmen and it was about Washington and whether they liked Obama or they didn't like Obama, Republicans. But there, the voters had the final say. They said, Mr. Congressman, you're out. New guy, you're in. And for the most part, the legislature has drawn their districts to be much safer, and that because the districts are smaller. And when you said that there's the lack of democracy, why does that matter? Because Albany runs the state. You think about the city council and the mayor, forget it. Everything comes out of Albany. The taxes, the education, health care, funding for CUNY, funding for everything, the tax structure of the state, everything comes out of Albany. What the mayor tries to do is work within those rules, the city council work within those rules, and that the foundational laws of New York City all come out of Albany. So if the fundamental problem is there's no democracy because the elections are fake and the districts are fake and the legislature's fake and there's no recourse for the people to express what they want, and that's the whole concept of a representative system. So I think we're
all
totally
understand
supportive
that.
on here.
Therefore,
Governor Jerry, after which gerrymandering,
Eldridge Jerry in Massachusetts,
right, 1820. Since that time, almost every state, not every state, because some states do have other means of redistricting, almost every state gerrymanders their legislature and gerrymanders. Wait a minute. And gerrymanders their congressional seats. And on it's gone for what would that be, almost 200 years now. 190 years. And you know what? It goes from party back here, back to here, back to here, back to here. The Republican Party came to birth during that time. There was no Republican Party at that time. And we have had, over this period of time, the most vibrant, the most productive, the most creative, and the most democratic country in not only in the world, in the history of the world. And this is the system that we're going to throw in the ash barrel and get some other system with blue ribbon people guiding everything.
Well, you don't like blue ribbon, right?
I don't
Different
like
color.
people who call themselves blue ribbon.
Well, you know,
A problem I have with blue ribbon is that usually it doesn't mean there's any people of color, notwithstanding the fact that they call it blue.
Well, I think the other thing that it's interesting, and just to add to the issues, is, for example, there are some complications also in terms of the Voting Rights Act and how, with this proposal. One of the things is that there's this thing about the deviation, how much each district can deviate from the other, you know, and the highest standard is with the congressional seats, which is 1%.
One person.
Which is the...
One
Exactly.
person. One person.
So-
One person deviation.
And in this bill that Cuomo proposed, he's talking about a 1%.
Right.
Yeah.
And so what happens is that that is, in terms of strict, you know, trying to keep the one person, one vote, that's the whole idea, right? But on the other hand, there's also the issue of how much flexibility you have. For example, in the Voting Rights Act, you know, it protects, with three counties in New York State are covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, Manhattan, the Bronx, and Brooklyn. And in those states, it's a very strong law because it means anytime they make any changes in the electoral system, including moving a polling station, has to be sent to the Justice Department for pre-clearance. In fact, this
To make sure it's not discriminatory.
in fact, this bill will have to be pre-cleared by the Justice Department itself.
If it passes.
So what happens is that the whole Voting Rights Act supposedly protects minority voters and make sure that you know their voting power is not diluted. But in creating these districts, sometimes because of the way people, you know, live, they don't live in neat boxes. You know, it'd be nice if you could just. I love some of those states in the West. They like just squares, man. You just square the thing up and that's it, you know. But here, it's obviously much more complicated in terms of these districts. For example, Jerry Nadler. My big redistricting joke is the fat congressman in the skinny district. Look at his district. He's like a heavyset guy, and his district's like this little ribbon.
Runs along the water.
Right,
there,
it's like a
Zabars to Nathans. Zabars to
One
Nathans.
person who could represent that district, and that's Jerry Nadler.
That's right. He's a great guy. But you know, that issue of the deviation becomes a little complicated because on the one hand, you want some degree of flexibility, not only around the Voting Rights Act, but also this thing about upstate. You know, you have the issue that you can't cross
River.
town boundaries, and all that.
Boundaries,
So there's some complications
mountains.
there. You know, there was the
Hamlets.
the issue.
Let me ask you, I want to go to questions, but just to follow up on that, it was my experience, and I covered as a reporter several redistrictings, and I was always struck, especially in minority communities, that minority elected officials exploited the Voting Rights Act to pack as many black, to pack as many Latino voters when they created the Bullwinkle district, for instance, for Nydia Velázquez, even though they had to chop off one of the antlers, you know, through the court, and that the Republicans said, "That's great, we support you in packing," because they knew that the surrounding districts were going to be, if there's some equation of minority being more likely to be Democrat and white voters being less likely to be Democrat, I don't know if you could say that in fact that had a lot to do with the Republicans taking the House in 1994, because all of a sudden you had this packing of people into Democratic districts and smaller majorities of Republicans in the surrounding districts, and you were protecting incumbents as opposed to pushing the kinds of policy agenda that I think that you think progressive elected officials should be doing.
I deal with that one, but I think it's an overgeneralization.
It's an overgeneralization. The Velázquez district, as the Bullwinkle district, as it was called. Eventually,
Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez, right?
Exactly. First Puerto Rican Congresswoman. Eventually, of course, that district was challenged by the Republican. I'm not talking about the folks in Albany. Let's get big here, folks. We're not talking about New York State. We're talking about people coming in from Texas to litigate about redistricting in New York City. experts come in from all over the country. They just run around a little dog and pony show to challenge districts. That's what happened to the Nydia Velázquez district. It was found to be too oddly shaped to be, mind you, Jerry Nadler does this.
He's got Chile.
got this.
He's got Chile.
Yeah. But this district was just too weird looking. So it was challenged, and it was then slightly compressed together to make it still a district that people of Latino descent could elect a representative of their choice. But the real question is, why was that district challenged, and why wasn't the Nadler district challenged?
Well, those are political reasons.
No, it wasn't a political.
No.
Well, you might say it's political reason, but it wasn't Albany.
No,
It was not Albany.
It was someone political from Texas who decided to
It wasn't some political from Texas. It was the larger Republican. Someone might even
Well, the
call it-
Republicans, a political party. That's why they. I mean,
yes.
There was a-
and is
Political.
what independent districting commission is going to stop that?
well, I don't.
Blank.
I don't think. I
No
don't.
one.
I don't think the Republicans in Texas or Washington are going to care about how fairly the New York Assembly,
yes, they
the New York
do.
Assembly, or New York Senate is drawn
Yes, they do.
to get some accountability into those institutions.
Yes, they do. They challenged. They came in from Texas and defended the Senate districts the last time around in New York.
Guy
State.
Vallela's district.
No, the entire plan.
Right. But,
entire
but
plan.
particularly Guy Vallela's district.
No, the entire plan. I litigated it. No, the entire plan. It wasn't anybody from New York City. It wasn't anybody from New York State. We're talking about national politics here. And yes, they came into New York State and litigated that. This is not some middle thing. I am in favor of reform. But let's not kid ourselves. Let's not be over naive. Let's get the reforms, but let's get the real people who we should be caring about involved. Not the blue ribbon panel, the people who are on the street living in New York State. Let's get them involved in terms of how government operates.
Those are
I like to see those kinds of options
You're saying you're
come around.
naive and young. That's cool.
Yeah.
Let's get this lady.
Tell us your name and your campus.
Hello, my name is Jocelyn Janot. I attend Lehman College, and my question is basically about the downstate, upstate issue with the budget and with politics in New York State in general. From my understanding, from what I've learned actually through the ETR program, the class I'm taking, is that there's a lot of conflict between the interests of upstate and interests of downstate, in particular with issues like public transportation, the SUNY and CUNY budgets. And I'm curious if in this sort of redistricting proposal, if you have any ideas of how that sort of those differences can be addressed, any sort of ideas?
And isn't it the case that that you have a disproportionate number of districts upstate, that the way you carve them up, at least on the road, not only on the size, but that, you have Senate districts in particular will be kind of coming into the city a little bit, but basically being outside of the city districts in order to maximize the number of Republicans. I don't
The
know.
city is 40% of the population of the state. So the city can't really, if everything were equal, the city couldn't really dictate what happens. What they do is there's a trade-off. The people upstate need certain things. They need roads. They need school aid. They need other things of that nature. Weather is a big problem up there
Prisons.
because buildings are exposed to very severe weather, and the heating bills are just enormous for schools and libraries and things. So those are the things they need. In New York City, we need transportation. Is a big problem here. So we have different interests, and we try to make sure that in the balance, in the arguments between the two areas, we try to make sure they try to make sure their needs are taken care of, and we try to make sure our needs are taken care of. I mean, that's what almost every democracy is about, and that's what almost every legislature, whether it be the House of Parliament in England or whether it be the state legislature in Albany or the Congress, that's what they do. That's why they get together and trade and argue and
Well,
fight.
we haven't gotten the final 2010 census figures yet. It should be coming pretty soon in terms of New York. And one of the dilemmas politically for upstate is that they're losing population upstate. So the districts are going to have to be, and downstate is growing. So that has a tremendous impact on redistricting, the size of the districts, the shapes of the districts. Most people that have looked at some of the preliminary numbers, for example, are saying it's going to be difficult, for example, for New York City to have districts totally contained within New York City, the way it's going so far. So that creates a real issue in terms of how you structure this thing, and that's where you have to have the transparency, because there are little tricks that are played with the deviations, for example, that can benefit one party versus the other. So that's part of, I think, of the struggle we're going to see. The other thing is we got to get, it's musical chairs with the Congress people. We've got to get rid of two of them. And how's that going to happen? Two Democrats or two Republicans, or are they going to usually, as they usually do, cut it down the middle, one Republican, one Democrat?
Well, one upstate, one downstate.
Yeah, one day. Then they thank God they caught that guy with the shirt off and stuff. And he's out.
He's out of here.
He's out of here. So,
Craig's left.
but then, like in New York,
Get a job on 2.5 Men.
so in New York, how does it make a lot of money? But who knows what happens in New York? People's speculation about this guy or that guy. So it's a tricky business, and the redistricting becomes really important in terms of where the power is and the advantage one party is going to have. However, Ed made a good point that if you read the stuff like 10 years ago and the projections about the reapportionment and redistricting and how the Republicans were going to win everything because of redistricting and the demography, you found it didn't quite work out that way. It was a little bit more complicated. In fact, by the end of the decade, you wound up, instead of with a Republican, with a Democratic president. So the process is not that straightforward. But again, the issue is the one we talked about.
Those damn voters keep getting in the way.
And the difference in quality of the candidates is a very important factor. The reason you have a Republican senator from Massachusetts is because the Democratic candidate was a doofus. And the people of Massachusetts...
That's a technical political term.
Technical. Right. And the people who go to Harvard and MIT, we do not want a doofus representing us, and they chose Senator Brown, who's not a doofus.
And who ironically took his shirt off.
Took his shirt off also, right? I see a pattern developing.
Yeah, please.
Let me get another question. Name and your campus, please.
My name is Marvin Toussaint. I'm from Queens College. I just wanted to know, what is the perfect system for this issue? Who has it, so that we know how it works, if it works?
The perfect system is to let me do it.
Oh, okay.
So other than that, it's kind of difficult.
Iowa constitutionally has a nonpartisan citizens system, which works. California's recently made changes. The problem in New York, it has been so purely, crassly partisan and political. And you were talking about Governor Jerry, but I didn't get a sense that you thought what he did was bad. And the sense in this country since 1820 is that gerrymandering is not good, because the district that he drew along the coast of Massachusetts that we're talking about, they said, "Ooh, it looks like a salamander. Let's call it a gerrymander." And because he had connected a bunch of towns surrounding Boston for some political benefit. And the people said, but that's not compact. There's no connection between these districts, between these communities. And you seem to say it with a sense of pride. And the problem is that Albany has perfected this to a science. So when the reforms that I'm talking about, or Ed Koch, we've been discussing here, are small steps in getting towards an Iowa system where it is nonpartisan and relatively clean, or California with citizen involvement. We are below the bottom. We're the worst in the country in terms of this, in many people's opinion, and we're just trying to get it a little bit above there.
That's fair.
Yes, sir.
How you doing? My name is William Leverett. I'm from Queens College. My question is, we were talking about transparency, and I feel like a lot of times in order to hold our elected officials accountable, the community needs to see what's going on. So I guess my question would be, in terms of the places where people receive the most information, whether it be like arts or media services, how would you propose a better way to just get that information out there? Because I know certain elected officials, they'll meet with their community members in order to discuss what's going on, but I'm not sure if that's happening across the board.
There's very little coverage of Albany in, I'll exempt the present company, but there's very little coverage of what happens in Albany in the New York City press. So you have an area of the state that is really dependent on the New York City press. About 50% of the state, probably, when you include the suburbs that listen to the TV programs, get almost no coverage whatsoever. They passed a reform to let press come into the committee meetings, but no press ever comes into the committee meetings. I had, I don't know how many committee meetings when I was chair of the higher education. No, maybe once or twice somebody from the press would come in. That's all. It doesn't happen. I think that.
What did they used to say about Central America? That Americans will do anything for Central America except read about it. So.
Yeah, Latin America in general. Yeah, but I think that there's transparency issue, the participation. There are ways that you can create rules like there are in this proposal to make sure there are public hearings, not only the frequency of the hearings, but where they're going to be held. Things like having the community have access to the data and to the mapping technology so that they also can develop their own plans. There are things like, which I'm disappointed in. I see, for example, the FCC, right? If you deal with the FCC, let's say I meet with the staff of the FCC, I have to write them a letter that they file saying that I spoke to them. That way there's no bullshit behind the scenes, And that's the kind of thing that I like to see around redistricting as well. Anybody who talks to the staff has got to, or a member of the commission has got to basically put, so those kinds of things I think empower the community, and those are the things that we have to strengthen right now. And I think, like I said, ultimately I think that the issue is, can we change the Constitution to make the line very clear, very bright between what the legislator's role is and the public's role is, and that's ultimately what I like.
I think you put your finger on the real question here, and that is, in today's age, I admit I'm of the old age, other age, the non-digital age. I still read newspapers. I confess that I read newspapers. Folks got their news from the print. Now, I'm happy to say that there's a lot more information out there, but the information about what happens in Albany is still like one of the best kept secrets. And I do say, again, present company accepted, because I do read coverage of what happens in Albany, at least some things in Albany. But there needs to be more of a demand as well.
But when Angelo talks about data being available and people being able to come in and look at it, it sounds very much like the City Districting Commission you sat on.
Yeah, it is. And I'm very proud to say that I was the vice chair of that commission, and
This is the commission that drew when the city council went from 35 seats to 51 seats, that had to draw new lines citywide.
Right. And I actually pressed and pressed and pressed, and we got them so that we had tons, I mean dozens of free terminals. Anyone could come in and use them. We had information forums. We had more forums anywhere that had ever existed in the entire state. We had any kind of information. We had it in different languages. So we tried to make it as accessible as possible, and I think that worked. In terms of the redistricting process, but I'm actually talking a little bit broader now. In terms of making Albany better, what people need to do, I'm fixing it. What people need to know is what is happening in Albany,
exactly,
and how Albany actually works. Even though my colleague here exaggerated a bit about one man, it's only a slight exaggeration. It really is broken.
Yes, sir.
My name is Carlos Santiago Cano from Baruch College, and my question was that, keeping in mind that district lines have to be in place before the 2012 election, which is less than 2 years from now, don't you think that instead of finding a short-term solution like we did with Obamacare, Albany should focus on more serious problems like balancing the budget, reducing taxes, helping the private sector create jobs, and reducing spending?
I mean, but do you think it's an either or? I mean, how do you have to, you are legally required. Once you have a census, the population shifts. You have to redraw the lines.
Well, but that's the argument that the Republicans are using, basically.
Right.
In as having signed, as you said, that
pledge.
They're backing
We'll
off
later, we'll go
by
later.
saying it's also that they rather, like you said, pay more attention to the budget, that kind of stuff. One of the things, though, I thought where you were going was when you talked about that this has to be done by a certain time, is the issue you raised, and that is that this thing has to be resolved by at least the end of this session. Otherwise, there's going to be a real time frame kind of crunch in terms, because remember, it has to go through the Justice Department, right, for pre-clearance. You have to have a petitioning period. You have to have public hearings. all this kind of stuff before that election. So that's the other thing, and that's where I think the Republicans have time on their side, because they number one, that issue is a powerful one, right? The big issue now is the budget.
It's only 18 months
redistricting.
between the next election.
And then the other thing is that these guys just got elected, so they could take a hit from Ed Koch. They could take the robocalls from Ed Koch, and it's not going to affect them by the time the election comes up.
You said the Republicans. We should be a little clearer. It's the Republicans in the state Senate.
Right, right.
And meanwhile, those 50 Republicans in the state assembly, they're all for this because they have been the oppressed minority for 30 years.
I guess it's going to pass in the assembly. Huh?
So they were the first people for this because they realized they have been drawn down into oblivion every 10 years, and they just said, hey, if we get a fair chance, maybe instead of having 50 seats, we'll have 60 seats. Maybe we'll get 65 seats, then, you know, up to the halfway point of 75. So we were talking about the independent commission, they have been excluded. And the Democrats have been excluded in the state Senate because the way it works in Albany, much more than in Washington, it's like, I have the power, you have nothing.
And
They changed the rules last week, where Dean Skelos is saying, look, if the Democrats in the Senate want to endorse this, fine. But now I find out they passed a rule, made some rule changes where the Democrats can't do that.
That's right. They won't even let them. They won't let them introduce the law. Yes,
So
ma'am.
just a good point.
Hi, my name is Danielle Reed from Queens College, and my question is for either Edward or Michael. Do you think that if a congressman represents a homogeneous district, that he'll pass better legislation, or that possibly because the district has more trust in him, he can get away with legislation that isn't as appropriate?
Well, it depends on in my opinion, it depends on the congressman, the congressperson, woman, and how they perceive. You know, you have a balance that you have to achieve. Your own conscience, the desires of your district, the politics of the area, the interests of the state. You have a lot of things you have to balance, and then finally come up with a judgment. You have to go yes or no on a bill. It's not the vote is not complicated, but the thinking that goes up to it is complicated. And I'd say there's no one answer to that. There's a lot of different. It depends on the congressperson.
But we only have a couple of minutes left. But are people better served by having diverse districts, or by having districts that are, let's say, ethnically or politically,
if it's a good
of
creative
a like mind?
If it's a good creative person, they're better served by having a diverse district. If it's a lump on a log, then they're better served by having a homogeneous.
Well, what do you mean by diverse? I mean, do you mean people who speak different languages in the district?
Yes.
People who have different religious traditions?
Yes.
Or people who have different political interests?
Yes.
And would tend to vote for different people. So that if every 2 years that member of Congress is going to have, really to work his or her rear end off to be reelected, that might be better.
You're talking about competitive districts.
Competitive districts. So it's not like, okay, I'm elected, and now 40 years later I'm still there, because every 2 years no one even bothers.
Except
to
that in this state, because of the this city being overwhelmingly Democratic, that takes place in the primary. That doesn't take place in the general election anyway.
Right, but the assemblyman who represents this studio, a gentleman named Mr. Gottfried, has been there for 40 years. So he's been reforming it for 40 years. And now it's all reformed. And under the rules of Albany, since he's been there the longest, he gets the biggest staff. So he's
chairman of the health committee. Incidentally,
in Washington, they say, you get 20 people, and you get 20 people, and you get 20 people, and you get 20 people. In Albany, it's like, oh, you get 100 people, and you get 2. Because the way it works in Albany, it's all decided by who has the power. And the people without get nothing. Unlike Washington, and unlike most of the country, legislative resources are divided by power and seniority in Albany.
But also, I think it's important to factor in the fact that, for example, communities of color, Black, Latino, Asians, have struggled to get fair representation in the system. So that what we have is this Voting Rights Act that promotes that. but also the idea, this concept of communities of interest, and that is that notion of having people who are like-minded in a district, who also, are cohesive and can be mobilized around certain issues, articulate those issues. Now, one of the problems is the underrepresentation of these various communities. I'm not saying that should be the only factor, but I think it's an important factor that sometimes we kind of throw out. Right now we're looking at the redistricting process in New Jersey and talk about Latino underrepresentation. So we're getting into these kinds of conversations. Meanwhile, Latinos are just not present. It's not good for the community in terms of its representation. Also not good for the legislative body to not have any diversity within it. So it's still a problem.
And Congresswoman Velasquez can make a legitimate point, a very legitimate point, that she has to represent people who are not living in her district. There are Latino women who need her, who need someone who speaks their language, who need someone who understands their particular problems, and they don't live in her district. And she has to represent them. And she should have more staff for that, I believe.
So, what do you think is going to happen? We have about a minute left. I mean, how independent? I mean, you've been watching this on a day-to-day basis.
Let's see. This is
it gonna
March.
happen?
This is March. They're going to push it off, and the Senate Republicans are happy to take robocalls from Ed Koch and be yelled at by the Daily News and the other people in the press and this panel and the people out there, because under Albany rules, you lose power and you're out. And they're afraid of that, and they're not going to budge.
How do you see this playing out?
Business as usual, Albany.
So, I mean, you think that this is going to wind up, Ed is quite persistent and won't go away, but you think that they will basically outweight this
Yes.
little furor?
I said that, and I sort of said it's tongue-in-cheek, but I mean it in both ways. If in fact, in regard to the changes that are necessary, that we do need reform, I do not think they're going to happen for all the wrong reasons. In regard to what's going to happen in terms of the real world, in terms of real world redistricting and democracy, I do not think that there's going to be too much change on the ground.
I just got the goodbye sign. I always make deadline. I want to thank you all, and we'll see you next time on CUNY Forum. Thank you.